us. And welcome everyone to the June event in our Scholars Library series. For those of you who haven't been here before, each month this initiative allows a scholar to come and talk about their literary works to those in the Rhodes community and also beyond, and it's really nice to see you all here. So for this edition, we're really excited to welcome Chisanga to talk about his book, Zambia, Pathways to Excellence, and fellow scholar Chishimba is here to moderate the conversation. Chishimba is a Zambian scholar studying for an MSc in Social Science of the Internet. She holds a Master's in Journalism and Media Studies, and her Master's research at the moment is investigating how Zambian feminists use Twitter to challenge patriarchy and gender non-conformity in Zambia's heteronormative society. So I'll post the link to purchase Chisanga's book in the chat, but for now I'll hand over to Chishimba, who will give you a further introduction to Chisanga, the session, and we can get right into it. So please post any questions you might have as we go along in the chat, and we can fit them into the section as we go or at the end. But over to you, Chishimba.
All right, thank you, Georgie. It's my pleasure to introduce Chisanga. So Chisanga is the president of the Masomo Education Foundation, a Canadian charitable organization that provides scholarships to young men and women from low-income families. Before that, he served as the Deputy Minister of the Ontarian Ministry of Citizenship, Immigration and International Trade. He was also Deputy Minister responsible for women's issues and senior affairs. Chisanga has also become the founding chair and CEO of the Ontarian Rental Housing Tribunal. Chisanga is also a Rhodes Scholar. He received a Master's of Laws degree from the University of Oxford, a BA and MA degree in Philosophy, Politics, Economics from Oxford, that is. In 2016, Chisanga completed the Director's Education Program of the Rotman School of Management, University of Toronto, obtaining the professional ICD designation granted by the Institution of Corporate Directors. It is my pleasure to welcome Chisanga to this fireside chat. For most Zambians who are joining this call, we know Chisanga as the man who's on the selection committee. So it's a privilege to even be able to ask him questions, to turn the tables and put him on the other side. So Chisanga, welcome to this conversation.
Well, thank you very much. The one thing I can promise you is I'm not going to be half as good as the people I interview. So please be kind to me. I may just reciprocate in the future.
Definitely. But Chisanga, it's a privilege again to introduce you to everybody and to have you, and for just making time to be here. So for everyone who's joining us, Chisanga just arrived in Zambia. He just arrived like a few hours ago and he was like, I'm going to show up for this. We don't take that lightly. We're so grateful. So I'm actually thinking before we even go into our conversation, I really just have to read the paragraph of the preface of your book. So the book is Zambia Pathways to Excellence. The preface is everything. So I'll just read a paragraph before we even start. So it goes like this. Events in Zambia can move very rapidly. 1 minute, it is a one-party dictatorship with no hope of getting out of the economic hole it has dug for itself. The next minute, it is a shining example of democracy and one of the fastest growing economies in the world. Before you know it, the country has a debt crisis and is reported by The Economist as slouching towards abject failure. Zambia has experienced all these in the space of 30 years. It is not just the country's dynamism, however, that makes it a challenging subject to study. The country is also frustratingly casual about exploiting the natural advantages it has over many other nations. These advantages go beyond the peaceable nature of Zambians and include an abundance of natural resources and good weather. Zambian intellectuals are often baffled by their political leaders' willingness to shun what they see as common sense solution to challenges. This is just beautiful, Chisanga. It was the first thing that caught my attention in your book. But before we even delve in your book, now that you've arrived in Zambia just a few hours ago, could you just tell us some of the things that you have seen so far that just make you think we're on this path to excellence? Is there anything that has struck you so far?
I don't think I'm ready to say we are on the path to excellence, but I am ready to say we can get on that path relatively easily. In other words, you do see an instinctive movement toward excellence, something I did not see before. For example, just look at the transformation of Lusaka. You see the kind of infrastructure we could only have dreamt of as recently as 20 years ago. You've got connectivity that we just did not have before. In terms of democratic development, look at how easily Zambians changed their governments and how smoothly they changed their governments. The former president who lost the election in August 2021 was criticized for taking 72 hours to concede. But he did concede, and he conceded before the counting was concluded. So he was going by the trends. By global standards, that's not a bad thing. But by Zambian standards, especially our young people are so impatient. It's a terrible thing. You must concede right away the moment you realize that you aren't going to win. In contrast, the loser of the 2020 election in the United States has yet to concede. He refuses to concede. So in terms of democratic development, although Zambia is a much, much younger country than the United States, I see a lot of hope here. And this is something we tend to forget. Zambia in its current form is only 58 years old. And I challenge anyone to find a country anywhere in the world in history where a country after 58 years not only had avoided civil war, not only wanted equal voting rights to both genders. There are very few countries with that track record. It took hundreds of years after the formation of the English state before women could vote. And it took almost 100 years after the founding, well, more than 100 years actually, after the founding of the United States before women could vote. And yet in Zambia, women had the vote from the get-go. And for those who criticize Zambia in places such as the United Kingdom, I would remind them about this. I'm addressing people who question Zambian democratic credentials. I have this question to put to them. The British were in Zambia as colonial masters for over 70 years. How many elections did they hold on the basis of one person, one vote? Not a single one. The first time you had one person, one vote was after independence with an indigenous government in power. So coming back to your question, I see signs of pathways to excellence being recognized on the pathway and play their part. I've already mentioned democratic development. I've talked about infrastructure, but also we have a conference coming up in Livingston, the Zambia Diaspora Conference. And much of that discussion is going to be about how Zambia can exploit her enormous potential and become excellent.
Yeah, I agree with you on that, Chisanga. So for the benefit of everyone who hasn't read the book or is not conversant with Zambian history, one of the things that you set out beautifully in the book is a pre-colonial history, a colonial history, and post-colonial history of Zambia. So can you just briefly tell us about the Berlin Conference and why this conference is very important for us to understand what this conference has done to many nations in Africa?
Yes, the Berlin Conference went on for quite a while, and its actual beginning is not clear, but it was around 1888 when the colonial powers of the world were invited around a table to carve up the African continent. Now, the carving up of the African continent wasn't on the basis of existing nations on the continent. It was on the basis of occupation and presence. So if the Portuguese had more people than the British and had more people than the French, and more people than the Spaniards in a particular locale, they would take control of that locale. The problem is that the boundaries that they drew completely ignored existing national boundaries. They completely ignored ethnic distribution. They completely ignored culture. As Lord Salisbury himself said at the conference, in a moment of great doubt, he said, "Gentlemen, I am concerned that here we are, a group of white males, carving up a continent we've never set foot on. We've been swapping mountains for lakes, for rivers, for that, but we've just never been there." And this is how the modern nations of Africa, with the exception of Ethiopia, were formed. The trouble is, each one of these countries then became a candidate for civil war. So when we talk about civil war on the African continent, the surprise is not that 5 or 6 out of 55 countries are vulnerable to civil war and have had civil war. The surprise is that not many more of them have had civil war. So really, this was a very bad hand that these countries were dealt.
Yeah, yeah. But Chisanga, I think one of the things that I wanted to get your opinion on is, how do you respond to critics, those who say maybe independence came too soon for Zambia, maybe Zambia could have been more developed had we remained colonized for longer? How do you respond to such critics?
Well, first I would refer them to Walter Rodney's book. And by the way, I met Mrs. Rodney in the 1990s in Jamaica, a wonderful woman. Unfortunately, I never met her husband. But the book, as you'll appreciate, I'm referring to is How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Now, if you accept that thesis and you accept the data that come with that thesis, you then have to conclude, as a matter of logic, that had the British continued as colonial masters, Zambia would have been even more underdeveloped, because the impact of colonialism was actually to underdevelop existing African nations and empires. Let's look at pre-colonial times. Why is it that prior to the 1600s, there was no cultural gap between African empires or African states and European ones? If anything, the African states and empires such as ancient Mali, Morocco had the first university in the world, although Timbuktu is better known. But these, if anything, these empires were more advanced than their European counterparts. Ethiopia adopted Christianity as one of the main religions in the 4th century. Let's ask ourselves where Britain was in the 4th century with respect to Christianity. So there was no cultural gap between European countries and African countries prior to the 1600s. The gap came later. And the reason there was no cultural gap is that the African empires, of course, were so well developed. Look at Zambezia. Zambezia is the ancient state from which Zambia derives its name. There's a splendid book written by an Andalusian Arab from what is now Western Saudi Arabia. And he's describing Zambezia in 900 AD. And he said in 900 AD, Zambezia had an unwritten constitution whose fundamental tenet was the king had to govern with equity. If the king did not govern with equity, the king would be removed. I ask you, how many countries, how many empires in 900 AD were concerned with governing with equity? So I totally reject this argument that the British should have stayed longer.
I hear you on that one. I hear you on that one. And I think one of my favorite chapters in the book, and we spoke about this earlier, is chapter 2, A Traumatized People.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned some of the consequences of colonialism by design was denting the indigenous self-confidence, the self-esteem, and the self-acceptance. So what do you think are some of the marks of colonialism in modern day Zambia, which you can point out?
Well, you don't colonize a people successfully unless you devise a way of controlling the thought process, how they think. And this is what the colonial powers did. And specifically, this is what the British colonial power did in Zambia. The first thing they did was to erase Zambian history and pretend there was no history until they got there. Second thing was to attempt to erase and certainly underplay pre-colonial civilization, because they had to come across as a civilizing force. So the end result that you have is that people believing they are culturally and maybe even psychologically dependent on the colonial master, because they cannot depend on their own civilization. They know very little about it. They cannot depend on their own history. It has been erased from their memory, at least until awkward people like myself come along and attempt to reintroduce it in mainstream society. So what you really have then is a feeling that people cannot achieve certain things. And you notice this at a practical level. When a project starts, people are enthusiastic about the project, but at the first sign of trouble or challenge, they default to failure or abandonment. How many things in Zambia have been built by foreigners that could have been built by Zambians? How often do foreign consultants get preferential treatment compared to Zambian consultants and experts who know more about the subject matter than the foreigners that are being called in? This is not to discourage cross-pollination of ideas, but this is to encourage respect of indigenous ideas, because they have a great deal to offer. So that, I think, in a nutshell, is a consequence of colonial domination.
Yeah, I just like how you mentioned that Zambians don't really know so much about our own history until people like you come up and tell us about our history. We spoke about this a few minutes ago when I told you that reading your book was the first time I came across the name Elliot Mwanafuna. I didn't know who Elliot Mwanafuna was until last weekend when I was reading your book. So I know there are so many Zambian scholars and even just scholars from other places who've joined this conversation today, and they have no idea of who Elliot Mwanafuna was, but I think that he's a very important figure. Do you mind just sharing the story of Elliot Mwanafuna with all of us?
Yes, very briefly. Elliot Mwanafuna was a trade unionist who participated, just speaking from memory, I think it was a 1940 strike on the copper belt. He wanted better pay and better working conditions, which included less racial discrimination. So a demonstration took place, and Elliot Mwanafuna participated in that demonstration. The colonial authorities responded by firing at demonstrators, and one of the bullets hit Elliot in the arm. So Elliot was taken to the clinic where he was treated. But instead of going home, he went back to demonstrate because he felt the issue was that important. And unfortunately, he irritated one of the colonial officers so much that the officer disemboweled him publicly on this, and he died on the spot. And I mentioned Elliot Mwanafuna in two senses. One is in the two contexts, rather. One is in the context of Zambians being a traumatized people as a result of the colonial experience. The second one relates to an earlier question you had. What's the impact? One of the impact is Zambians understate their contributions. And can you believe that a person who showed so much bravery, there is not a single monument to honor him. There is not a single street named after him. And as you rightly observed, a lot of Zambians have never heard his name. And my guess, I hope I'm wrong, but my guess is a majority of the country has never heard this name.
I have to agree with you on that one. Like I mentioned earlier, I had to call my dad in Zambia to ask him to say, Dad, who's Elliot Mulenga? Because it was the first time I was hearing of Elliot Mulenga. But Chisanga, I can go on and on talking, but I want to take a moment to ask if there's a question from anyone who's joined us. They could feel free to like unmute yourself and ask the question, or just pop it in the chat if there's a question from anyone who's joined us.
Yeah, I have a question and more so a comment. I really like how I'm so sorry, I have a cold. You sort of outlined how generally the consensus in Zambia is always very negative. We never do highlight some of our achievements and some of the things that we've gotten right, even with political parties and our approach towards democracy. So I just wanted to get your input on how we might address this. I feel like it is psychological. It's sort of this, especially when it comes to the government. If the government's covering something, you know it's not going to follow through, or you're going to take forever to get it done. And there's just this lingering sort of complacency, almost as if Zambians aren't able to be completely motivated to carry something through. But just like you've highlighted, there are people like Elliot Mwanafuna, who I never heard about, who are willing to die for what they believed in. I think that's generally that's not what you think of when you think about Zambians right off the bat. So how do we address these rumors and sort of change the psychology and how we think about ourselves?
Thank you.
You know, that's a great question. It's like, I don't know if you've read Zambia Pathways to Excellence, but I think Chishimba, who's read it, will agree with me. There is a chapter there called Getting Zambians to Know Zambia, or the other way around. And so the answer to your question is Zambians must get to know themselves, and they cannot do that without knowing their history, number one. Number two, they have to also teach that history. That means changing the curriculum, particularly for very young people. For example, an educated person in Zambia today will boast that they know everything there is to know about the Battle of Hastings. Now, that's a very good thing, yes. But how about the Battle of Mbandakasi, where the Congolese, the Congo state, spelled with a K, the Congo state repelled a surprise attack by the Portuguese army and defeated the Portuguese army? Would that not help with the confidence of Zambians if they knew that part of their history? Would it not help with their confidence if they knew about Elliot Mulenga, talking about individuals? Would it not help with their confidence if they knew about Stephen Impashi, a man who wrote over 20 books in his life? He was a graduate of Exeter University, and he'd read creative writing at Exeter. And what he has written really is such splendid material that it lends itself both to the big screen as well as to the stage. So really, in a nutshell, this is what needs to happen. The country needs to know about its history, it needs to teach its history, and thirdly, it needs to celebrate its heroes and heroines. So, and you can do that by having categories. An annual prize, for example, for Entrepreneur of the Year, named after Anna Chilombo or Anne Lengalenga, something like that. That serves as a constant reminder of where Zambia has come from. It serves as a constant reminder of Zambian excellence.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Chisanga on that one. Do we have any other questions from anyone? Feel free to unmute yourself.
Yes, I have a question. Hi, Chisanga. My name is Tafadzwa. I'm from Zimbabwe. And
Hi, Fadza.
Hi. So my question naturally is not focused on Zambia. It's actually just a question. In your opinion, what role does the development of neighboring countries influence the path to excellence? For example, in Zambia, how would the neighboring countries, the development of the neighboring countries impact the path to excellence, as you would say?
The neighboring countries have a great role to play in the development of Zambia in terms of improving Zambian self-esteem, self-acceptance, and in terms of Zambia understanding its history. For this reason, if you look at Zimbabwe, Angola, the current Congo, not the original Congo with a K, the histories of these countries intersect with the history of Zambia. So that alone suggests that there are common issues to be addressed. And perhaps these issues can be best understood if they were addressed collectively, where it was appropriate to do so. So cooperation is very important. And in terms of improving the self-esteem of Zambians, the dent in the self-esteem comes mostly from their specific colonial experience, but more broadly, it comes from the disparaging of people who look like them and people who come from their continent. And that is based on the false assumption that people who look like you, people in your neighborhood, have never really contributed anything to civilization. Someone like you will find that laughable because, of course, you will remember that Zimbabwe, great Zimbabwe, not the current Zimbabwe, was a pioneer in architecture in the 1300s and 1400s. I'm not going to get into the argument as to whether Zimbabwe was born out of Mapungubwe or not, because both of them were Southern African states. But you look at just the magnificence of great Zimbabwe, the construction of great Zimbabwe. It took so much ingenuity, so much engineering, so much planning. I understand on reliable authority that the drainage system constructed, I think in the 1390s or thereabouts, still works to this day. And this is such a powerful statement to make. And I would really want Zambians and Zimbabweans to collaborate on this point, because both of them benefit from the world knowing about this. And this is such an important thing. And I'll tell you how important it is. During the Smith regime, a falsehood went out that Great Zimbabwe was built by the Queen of Sheba. And this is what children in white schools were taught. Of course, children in Shona traditional settings knew from oral history that their ancestors had built this, but they had no power at that time. And this myth was only killed when eventually carbon dating was done and proved that this was built way after the Queen of Sheba, and it was built by the people who resided there, and had similarities to similar civilizations in Mozambique and in South Africa. Now, the approach taken by the apartheid government in South Africa was quite different and even more draconian. Instead of arguing about who built Mapungubwe, they simply enclosed it and turned it into a no-go area. It was a security area that you could not go into. But fortunately, they allowed some archaeologists and historians to collect data on condition that that was not published. So this data were kept in the basement of the University of Pretoria, I believe it was, and was not really opened up until the 1990s after apartheid had ended. So that's a long-winded way of answering your question of how these countries can cooperate, or rather whether there is a role for neighboring countries. My answer is a definite yes. There is a role for neighboring countries.
Yeah. Thank you, Chisanga. Thank you, Tafadza, for that question. We'll take in some more questions. If there's anyone with a question, please feel free to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Chishimba, for conducting this, and also thank you, Chisanga, for your very insightful talk. I think with regards to sort of the pathways to excellence, and I think one of Chishimba's first questions with the rapid industrialization and development in Zambia in the sort of last few, maybe in the last 10 years, there's been a lot of foreign influence in this. There's been, and it's also the sort of a part of it has a lack of consideration of sustainability of how these the new sort of buildings, how long they're going to last. How would you encourage bringing in this local knowledge of sort of architecture and local knowledge into incorporating it? Like what is your opinion? How would you suggest incorporating this in sort of future development stages in and around Zambia?
I think that's a great question, Varuma. I assume you finished because my internet sort of went wobbly there for a moment. That's a great question. The way you do it is to maximize opportunities for Zambians. For example, I call in the book for enlightened procurement processes. I'll just give you one example. And this will interest you, Varun. I know you have an interest in manufacturing motor vehicles, and I am looking forward to one day driving an electric car manufactured by you. You'll be the third African to produce an excellent electric car after Jaleni of Nigeria and Elon Musk of South Africa. So this is what you could do. The Zambian government, let's imagine the Zambian government says, today is what, the 22nd, I think, of June. The Zambian government says, look, from the 31st of December, 2023, we are not going to consume anything that has no Zambian content. And that includes motor vehicles. Now let's zero in on motor vehicles. The Zambian government imports about, actually it's now about 15,000, but the figure used in the book is 12,000. So let's stick to that. They import 12,000 motor vehicles every year. If they said we are not going to import these motor vehicles, if necessary, we are going to walk to work or ride bicycles or use ox-drawn carts. You know, if they said that, I can assure you, within weeks, you're going to have proposals from a number of people wanting that contract. And why would they want it? Because they are guaranteed a market of 12,000 motor vehicles. Of course, that's not going to be their only market. The members of the public will be buying from them as well. And going back to Fadzwa's question, members in the SADC region will be buying it where the vehicle had quality and was well priced. But let's just focus on that 12,000 alone. On average, in this part of the world, you need about 5 people, 5.2 actually, but I ignore the 0.2 because I've never met a person who's only 0.2. But you need about 5 people to make one vehicle. So potentially, just by making that policy, you increase employment by 60,000, right? 12,000 times 5. And here's a really interesting part. The multiplier effect in the automotive industry in North America and Europe is between 7 and 8. But in my book, I use 5 to be conservative. That is the number of jobs you create for every job you create in the automotive industry. So on that basis, this industry alone will generate 300,000 jobs. So not only are you employing your best skilled people, but you're also generating new employment and offering opportunities to people who would otherwise not have access to good paying middle-class jobs.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I think, sorry, if I could just jump back in. It's a very sort of interesting answer, and I really appreciate that. One of the things that I find difficult is it sort of pioneering those innovative projects. What I've seen all or building that sort of building Mulungushi Conference Center, right, like by the parliament, the contracts are dished out to foreigners where it's possible to achieve the development in a quicker time scale and potentially a lower cost. So how do you address that part? How do you address that part? the sort of, because I think that's where education would be really important on how to bring in manufacturing and scale manufacturing, but I would like to hear your opinions.
Well, the assembly plant will almost certainly come from abroad, right? At least initially. So whichever way we go, that's going to happen. But in terms of the skills, we are going to give an opportunity to Zambians who are highly skilled and are already functioning in those areas abroad, in the diaspora, in addition to giving skills to Zambians at home. And let me give you an example of how we tend to, sorry, your face has just been covered by a message from Rhodes House. An example of how we tend to exaggerate our dependency on foreign skills. The largest copper mine in Zambia is Kansanshi mines. They have, I think, either the most sophisticated and the largest smelter in the world, or the second largest. There is some dispute because the smelter that claims to be the largest is the largest only because the module was added to it. That same module can be added to this smelter. So in terms of the standalone smelter, Kansanshi has the largest one, and it's very there, and I just marvel. And the entire mine is very, very sophisticated. But of the 8,000, 3% is expatriate. 97% of the labor force is Zambia. It's the Zambians who run that mine. And I have no doubt, because if you're starting off with a car assembly plant, that's not going to be as sophisticated as this mine. So I would not be surprised if at the very least 90% of the labor was Zambian.
Thank you, Chisanga, and thank you, Varun, for that question. So Chisanga, in your book, when you're talking about turning Zambia into an economic powerhouse, you do mention the vehicle assembly plants, you do mention mining, but I also found some interesting sectors that you brought about. One of them is horticulture. Could you just briefly explain how we can maximize on that?
I apologize. The host reminded me that I was on mute. Thank you, Georgie. When you talk about horticulture, it means 2-3 areas, but the one we focus on are flowers. And these have to be picked fresh, put on the plane, and exported, typically to Holland, but other destinations around the world. And in 2000, 2001, this business was beginning to grow in Zambia and had 12,000 employees. And then it started to go on the decline. And the research is very clear as to why it went on the decline. It became the freight cost increased. And the freight cost increased because aviation fuel increased, the cost of aviation fuel increased, landing fees increased. And I think they increased between, say, 2000 and 2001 and about 2020 was something like 50%. The end result is fewer than 6,000 people are now employed in this area. And that's a great pity, because horticulture is a labor-intensive employer. So it can very quickly employ people. And I give the example, I think, I can't remember if it's in this book or another, but I think the example I gave is that of Kenya, where in 2000, Kenya was earning $134 million from horticulture. By 2020, that figure had gone up to $700 million. And the number of employees in the industry was 70,000. That is worth paying attention to.
Yeah. So definitely, I'll just speak on the other two, which I found very interesting. One of them was the concept of call centers as a means of creating employment. I never even thought of that until I read your book. So for the benefits of everybody else joining us who hasn't read your book, maybe you could briefly explain how we can, maximize on the call centers.
Yeah, I think it was Chisanga who mentioned, and I think you implied it also in one of your questions, that there is this tendency to be negative about everything Zambia, and we tend to look at disadvantages. So, for example, we never see being landlocked as an advantage. It's always a disadvantage. If only we had access to the sea, we'd be wealthy, etc., etc. Well, Switzerland is wealthy. Switzerland is landlocked. But in this particular case of call centers, this is almost a gift, a divine gift. Zambia just happens to be almost in the middle of the world. So if you have a call center, that call center will interact with most of the world during normal working hours. So at 9 a.m., it will be, I think it will be 8 in Lagos, the largest economy on the continent. 9 a.m. in Zambia will be 9 a.m. in South Africa, the most sophisticated economy on the continent. 9 a.m. in Zambia will be 8 a.m. in summertime in London. And you'll still be able to catch the markets in New York. And you catch the markets in the Far East just before they close. That's a real gift. Why not use it? And here's the plan. Zambia has a very large number of underemployed, even unemployed university graduates who speak quite well and certainly can learn quite quickly. Why not encourage them to go into call centers? And here's the reason why existing call centers in North America would come here. Existing call centers in North America struggle to attract labor, to attract employees, because they only pay on average $11.81 an hour. So if you went to them and said, look, come to Zambia, we're going to give you better educated people. People will be keen and happy to do this job and may even do it on a long-term basis. And they'll be happy to receive $2, $3 an hour. That's a huge saving for the person coming here. But if you look at the purchasing power parity in Zambia, $3 goes a long way. And I mean, a bag of meal meal is about $8. And the family can live on that for a month. They have to buy vegetables and meat, of course. But that just gives you an idea of what $2, $3 an hour does. In any case, that translates to what, $24 a day. You're talking about over 200 a week. That's a significant income and places you in the middle class. So that's the idea there. Take advantage of geography. Get these companies to relocate. They'll be happy to relocate. South Africa is being quite successful in that area, but Zambia is even more competitive than South Africa.
True. And I think the last sector you talk about, which I think Varun will find very interesting, is about the bamboo. And you call it don't forget the bamboo. I love that. Could you just tell us more about that?
I apologize again, I stayed on mute. A few years ago, I read about a guy called Chishimba Kasanga, and he had co-founded a bamboo bike frame and co-founded a company called Zambikes. They basically use bamboo to make bicycles, certainly to make the bicycle frame. And this has now become a luxury item. And he's selling these bicycles to Singapore, the US, Japan, Germany, and I think there is one other market. And that's the kind of thing you need to encourage, not just with respect to bicycles, but you can make bamboo shirts, bamboo socks, bamboo pillows, And bamboos in Zambia grow naturally. We're not at the point where we have to start bamboo plantations. And all this is money just crying out to be made. It's like money saying, here I am, pick me, take me, become prosperous.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I like how you just say that we have so much money lying around just crying for us to use it. I think that's what you mentioned in the preface, to say there are certain things that will just, maybe annoy is too strong of a word, to be like, why aren't we thinking of this? Why aren't we doing that? But we're almost hitting the hour of 6. So I wanted to give an opportunity to anybody who has a pressing question for Chisanga. Feel free to unmute yourselves.
I was just gonna ask to see if I could get your thoughts on sort of healthcare. I know that part of the Sustainable Development Goals is to transfer some of the responsibility that our donors have had in terms of managing our healthcare systems to the Ministry of Health. I just wanted to hear what you thought about that. Because having worked in healthcare and been based in like a rural setup, there's so much reliance on donors and their employees, and just the thought of them leaving is just unfathomable right now. So just your thoughts on what that might mean in the next few years and how Zambia might actually transition and afford it as well.
Yeah, I'll start with the last point you make, Chisanga. That's an extremely important point. But firstly, let me just say, in my view, I've advocated this for several years now. I think a responsible government would have 3 development priorities. It would be education, healthcare, and food security. Now, since we are talking about healthcare, the first thing we do is to recognize that we cannot wish away the cost of producing a good doctor, or the cost of producing a good nurse, or the cost of producing a good paramedic. That cost exists. You simply can't wake up and say, right, we're going to build this university. You can go to medical school, you'll pay no more than 2,000. That's ridiculous. What you're going to have are overcrowded classes where people learn very little. And then the fortunate students will go to private schools, and you'll end up with an inequality gap, and there'll be a selection. There'll be some doctors will be better valued than others, and that will lead to distortions in the healthcare system. So the first thing you do is to recognize the actual cost of producing a doctor, producing a nurse, producing a paramedic, whatever it is. Once you recognize the cost, you then say, right, if we want good doctors, if we want excellent medical staff, this is what we have to spend. The question then becomes, how do we pay for this? That should be the only question. The question cannot be, well, we can't afford this, so we shan't pay for it. No, you have to pay for it. So it could be the taxpayer footing the entire bill. It could be the parents. It could be the students themselves through loans, which I'm not in favor of. Or it could be a combination of those 3 things. But something has to be done. And we'll find the money, because that's the development priority. Now, the second thing you do is to look at the healthcare infrastructure that we have. I went to UTH, I think the last time I went to UTH was about 4 or 5 years ago. And if you ignore the neglect, that's great infrastructure. And it's got fantastic facilities. The trouble is it's overcrowded. So what I would do in the case of UTH, I would actually sell it to an international caregiver company and turn it into an international hospital, with the proviso that a certain percentage of the patients must be allowed to go in free. Now, how do you use that money? This is a controversial proposal, I admit. How do you use that money? You take a leaf out of, there is an architect, his last name was Cameron. and he wrote a book called Design as If You Give a Damn. And this guy came up with a method of designing hospitals with, I think, 100, 200 bed capacity for less than $1 million. And what you then do from the proceeds of sale is to have 2 of these hospitals, at least 2 in each province. What does that do? That decongests the UTH. The second thing you do with the money is to create a trust fund for the education of doctors and nurses to make sure that you maintain that quality. And then, of course, you have a fund for emergencies when the national budget fails. I think you have to make hard decisions like that to really have a workable and working healthcare system.
Are there any other questions? Please feel free to unmute yourself. All right.
I thought Chisanga was going to follow up with the healthcare insurance, but she did not, so I'm happy.
No, I was gonna say something, but I looked at the time.
No, you can
Okay.
ask Chisanga, it's fine.
Yeah, it is on the national healthcare insurance, and I think it's a wonderful idea. It's great. I mean, I've benefited from it. I just wanted to get your thoughts on it in the long haul, and also I feel like whenever I talk about healthcare and what's happening on the ground, there's a general consensus that Zambia doesn't have equipped staff. But I beg to argue, like, I know so many people who I've graduated with, and that was my undergrad, that was 3 years ago, they still don't have employment. And what you'll often find is in the rural areas, the government would prefer to have a clinical officer there or a nurse because they're cheaper to sustain. So I think the big issue is the sustainability in terms of managing the cost of having a strong healthcare system.
Health insurance is a great idea. And by the way, just before I go into that, I agree with you. Number one, Zambia has excellent doctors. Sometimes they don't have the equipment they need. They work under very difficult conditions, but they are excellent doctors. And I speak as a person whose brother-in-law had brain surgery in Lusaka less than a year ago. And guess what? He's back to normal. He's functioning. I don't think there are too many countries in the world where that would happen. But in terms of sustainable funding, Chisanga, my proposal would be you have an insurance scheme, but that insurance scheme in part will depend on where you live. So if you live, you divide the country into zones according to levels of development. So if you live in Lusaka, Ndola, Chingola, Kitwe, Livingstone, Mufulira, Luansha, you have to pay a certain amount. It could be monthly, it could be, but you have to pay premiums. And when you are ill, then you have the benefit. And of course, you have to have as many young people enrolled as possible because they are not great users of the system. And because they aren't great users of the system, they sort of subsidize the elderly and very young children who need it. And women tend to use it more often than men in general. You do that. But that premium, the highest premium is paid in these developed zones. With respect to people who live in rural areas, the premium should be zero. And what that does is it gives people in rural areas excellent healthcare for nothing, but it also stops the rural-urban migration flow. And when that stops, it keeps able-bodied people, men and women, in rural areas who then can develop those areas. So this is really it's enlightened self-interest, if you like. But those are the lines. I could write a book on that, but that would be my summary of the argument for now.
Yeah. We're almost hitting the hour. And Chisanga, again, your book it's a joy to read. There were moments when I wanted to throw it down because I got so upset when I realized how much we've been sleeping on our potential as a country. And there were moments of hope when I read it, and I felt proud to say, oh, I'm part of this country with so much potential. Definitely your book is a conversation starter. Even among us scholars in Oxford, I'm sure it will go around. Everybody will have like a chance to read it. And like you said earlier, it's up to us to pick on the things you have given us in the book, to fight the words fight. Like you asked Varun, how are you changing the words? So maybe we can just start by, reading your book and picking on some things. But before I let you go, my last question would be, what inspired you to write the book at this time? I know you published it a year ago, but what inspired you?
I was inspired generally by my role models, and particularly my mother. The one thing my role models had, the ones who really influenced me, was they always strove to do better. They always wanted to aim higher. They believed in self-exertion. My mother in particular, my father was a political prisoner during the Kaunda years because he was opposed to the setting up of the one-party state. And my mother was left to run the family business and look after the young kids and so on. But she always behaved as if she could do more. And that drove the point home to me that you should never sit on your potential. You should always utilize it. You may not achieve it entirely, but you should achieve something. So, you may not get to the moon, but you might hit one of the stars.
Thank you. That's just a perfect way of closing off this session. Even if we don't hit the moon, let's at least aim to hit the stars. Thank you so much, Chisanga. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. We're looking forward to having more conversations, and definitely I'm hoping this book ends up in the right hands, and I hope more Zambians read your book and continue having this conversation with you. But thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much to you for moderating. Thank you, Georgie, for organizing this. Nice to see you again, Chisaka, Varun. Tafadzwa, thank you very much for your wonderful question. We didn't hear from Claudia. Or is it Claudia? My Italian friends say Claudia.
Thank you so much, Chisanga. Over to you, Georgie.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, Lucy, Arnold, bye.